A lone man hides in the desert, haunted by scars of a violent past, vowing never to fight again. But when a ruthless gang pushes him to the edge, he's forced to break his promise, leading to a final showdown that reveals a truth he wasn't ready to face. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of ochre and amber under the relentless sun. The wind whispered through the sparse vegetation, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush. At the heart of this desolation stood a modest wooden cabin, its walls weathered by years of solitude and sandstorms. This was home to Joaquin, known locally and rarely as El Silencio. Joaquin's days followed a strict rhythm, dictated more by necessity than choice. At dawn, he fetched water from the underground well, the metal bucket creaking as it emerged, heavy with its burden. By noon, he worked on minor repairs to his cabin, or tended to the small patch of herbs he cultivated behind it. Evenings were spent beneath the stars, a tin mug of bitter coffee in hand, the silence around him broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote. Yet the stillness of his routine belied a deeper turmoil. His hands bore the calluses of a man accustomed to hardship, his back marked with scars that told stories he refused to share. On restless nights, he would awaken, gasping, drenched in sweat, haunted by memories that never quite faded. But Joaquin was nothing if not disciplined, and he buried these shadows beneath the weight of his silence. Once every few weeks, he made the journey to the nearest outpost, a bar that doubled as a general store, to stock up on essentials. The establishment, run by a sharp-eyed woman named Maria, was a haven for travelers and locals alike. Today was one such day. As Joaquin stepped inside, the low murmur of conversation briefly ceased. Heads turned, and whispers followed him like shadows. His presence, though infrequent, was enough to stir curiosity. Joaquin ignored the stares, heading straight for the counter where Maria greeted him with a cautious smile. "Stocking up again?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of warmth and wariness. He nodded, handing her a list scribbled on a torn piece of paper. She glanced at it before disappearing into the back, leaving Joaquin to wait in silence. It was then that he felt their eyes on him, sharp, predatory. Turning slightly, he spotted Coyote and his gang occupying a corner of the bar. They were loud, their laughter grating against the quiet atmosphere, their presence impossible to ignore. Coyote, a wiry man with a face weathered by the sun and a permanent sneer, leaned back in his chair, watching Joaquin with a glint of malice. "Hey, old man," Coyote called out, his voice carrying across the room. "You think you're too good to drink with us?" Joaquin didn't answer. He met Coyote's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the counter. The gang's laughter grew louder, but Joaquin didn't flinch. Maria returned with a box of supplies, setting it down with a heavy thud. "Maybe best you head out now," she murmured, her tone laced with concern. Joaquin paid and left without a word. As he loaded his supplies onto his truck, he felt the weight of their stares on his back. He climbed into the vehicle, the engine roaring to life, and drove off, the bar shrinking into the horizon behind him. Back at his cabin, Joaquin unpacked his supplies methodically, his movements calm and deliberate. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tranquility he had fought so hard to preserve was beginning to unravel. The desert had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself and escape the chaos of his past. Yet now, with Coyote's mocking laughter echoing in his ears, Joaquin couldn't help but wonder if his peace was nothing more than an illusion. The bar's door creaked open as Joaquin stepped out, but the tension inside lingered long after his departure. Coyote leaned back in his chair, his boots propped arrogantly on the edge of the table. The faint smirk on his face hinted at a growing fixation. Joaquin's silence, his refusal to engage, was like a thorn digging under Coyote's skin. "Who does he think he is?" one of the gang members muttered, glancing nervously at their leader. Coyote didn't answer immediately. He lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly as the smoke curled upward. "A man like that," he said finally, "thinks he's better than us. We'll see about that." By the time Joaquin's truck rumbled back to his cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. He unloaded his supplies, his mind preoccupied with the events at the bar. The gang's laughter and Coyote's mocking voice replayed in his head, but he forced the thoughts aside. Joaquin had spent years perfecting the art of ignoring provocation, burying his emotions beneath layers of restraint. Still, his instincts itched. a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He glanced toward the horizon, scanning the desert's emptiness. Nothing stirred, but the quiet felt heavier than usual. The following afternoon, Joaquin made his way back to the bar to collect a part Maria had promised to order for him. The place was quieter than usual, the few patrons present casting wary glances toward the corner where Coyote and his gang lounged. Their presence hung over the room like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. Joaquin kept his eyes forward as he entered, walking to the counter where Maria waited. She handed him a small package, her fingers brushing his briefly. "They've been asking about you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of conversation. "Be careful." He gave her a slight nod, taking the package and turning to leave. But as he approached the door, a chair scraped loudly against the floor, halting his steps. "Well, well," Coyote drawled, rising slowly. "Look who decided to show his face again." Joaquin didn't respond. He adjusted the package under his arm and kept walking, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. "Hey!" Coyote barked, his voice sharper now. "I'm talking to you!" The room fell silent, all eyes on the two men. Joaquin stopped at the door, his hand resting on the frame. For a moment, he considered his options, weighing the consequences of a single word or action. Then, without turning, he pushed the door open and stepped outside. Laughter erupted behind him, forced, cruel, meant to provoke. Joaquin walked to his truck, his movements calm and deliberate. But as he approached, his steps faltered. The windshield was shattered, the tires slashed. The word "coward" was scratched deeply into the driver's side door. Joaquin stared at the damage for a long moment. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening as he fought the urge to react. Finally, he turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, the package still tucked under his arm. Inside the bar, Maria confronted Coyote, her voice low but furious. "That man has done nothing to you. Leave him be." Coyote grinned, leaning closer. "He's done nothing because he's hiding something, and I'm going to find out what." Out in the desert, the sun beat down on Joaquin as he walked. Each step stirred memories he had spent years suppressing, memories of battles fought and lives lost. But as his cabin came into view, he forced the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the simple task of repairing his truck. Yet as he reached for his tools, a single question lingered in his mind. How much longer could he avoid the storm brewing on the horizon? The stillness of the desert night was shattered by the distant roar of motorcycles. Joaquin stirred from his bed, the faint vibrations in the ground setting his nerves on edge. He reached instinctively for the knife he kept beneath his pillow, his grip tightening as the sound grew closer. Shadows danced outside his window, cast by the flickering beams of headlights. The gang had arrived. Glass shattered as a rock crashed through the window, landing in the middle of the room. Joaquin stayed low, his movements deliberate and controlled. As the chaos outside intensified, the gang whooped and hollered, their voices echoing through the emptiness. They smashed bottles against the cabin walls, kicked over barrels, and set fire to a small pile of discarded wood near the porch. "Come out, El Silencio!" Coyote's voice cut through the noise, sharp and taunting. "Let's see what makes you so special." Joaquin remained hidden in the shadows, his breath steady. He wasn't afraid. Fear had been stripped from him long ago, but he knew the cost of confrontation. His eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where a battered photograph of his family sat on a wooden shelf. The memories tied to that image held him in place, anchoring him against the storm outside. The gang's assault escalated. They smashed the porch railing, slashed through the few belongings Joaquin had left outside, and sprayed crude graffiti on the walls. A loud crack signaled the destruction of his water barrel. Joaquin winced at the sound but didn't move. "Coward!" another voice yelled, followed by a burst of laughter. The insult hung in the air, sharper than the sound of breaking glass. Finally, the chaos began to subside. One by one, the gang members climbed back onto their motorcycles, revving their engines in unison. Coyote lingered, his eyes scanning the cabin for any sign of movement. When none came, he smirked and spit on the ground before mounting his bike. As the roar of engines faded into the distance, silence reclaimed the desert. Joaquin emerged from the shadows, his knife still in hand. His expression was calm, almost eerily so, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He stepped outside to assess the damage, the moonlight casting long shadows over the wreckage. The cabin was a mess, Shards of glass littered the floor. The graffiti scrawled across the walls, a cruel reminder of the gang's presence. Joaquin moved methodically, gathering broken pieces and stacking them neatly by the porch. When he reached the ruined water barrel, he paused, his fingers brushing the jagged edges of the wood. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before him, offering no answers, no solace. But something had shifted within Joaquin, a subtle but undeniable change. His shoulders, once burdened by the weight of restraint, straightened. His jaw tightened and his grip on the knife firmed. By dawn, the cabin was quiet again, its damage cleaned as best as possible. Joaquin sat on the porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, staring out at the rising sun. The peaceful facade he had maintained for so long was cracking, and beneath it lay a man forged in the fires of violence and loss. As the first rays of sunlight painted the desert in hues of gold, Joaquin set the empty mug down beside him. His eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. The past he had fought so hard to leave behind was stirring, and the storm that had been brewing was no longer something he could ignore. The town had always carried an air of quiet resignation, its dusty streets lined with faded storefronts and weary faces. Life moved slowly here, and for many, survival was a matter of endurance rather than hope. But in the days following the gang's attack on Joaquin's cabin, the unease that had long simmered beneath the surface began to bubble over. The morning after the raid, Maria stood behind the bar, her sharp eyes scanning the few patrons gathered inside. Conversations were hushed, voices tense. Rumors of the gang's growing boldness spread like wildfire, each account more exaggerated than the last. Maria caught snippets of their fears, how the gang would retaliate if challenged, how Joaquin's silence might provoke them further. "Someone has to do something," an older man muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "We can't just sit back and wait for them to burn the whole town down." "Do what?" another snapped. "Fight them. We're not soldiers. We're not like him." At that, the room fell silent. Maria's jaw tightened as she wiped down the counter, her thoughts lingering on Joaquin. She hadn't seen him since the attack, though word of the vandalism had spread quickly. Despite her concern, she knew better than to approach him uninvited. That afternoon, Joaquin arrived in town. His truck, patched up and functional, still bore the scars of the gang's vandalism, a grim testament to their power. He parked near the bar, drawing the attention of passers-by, their gazes a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As he stepped out, his calm, unhurried demeanor only added to the air of mystery surrounding him. Inside the bar, Maria greeted him with a nod, but her usual warmth was tinged with unease. "You all right?" she asked quietly, sliding him a cup of coffee. Joaquin took a sip before answering. "I'm fine." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. The gang's getting bolder. People are scared." "They should be," Joaquin said simply, setting the cup down. Maria frowned. "So what? You're just going to let them keep pushing until someone else gets hurt?" Joaquin's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. Violence solves nothing. "Try telling that to them," Maria snapped, her frustration breaking through. She softened her tone almost immediately. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to prove by staying out of this, but people are starting to blame you for what's happening." Joaquin didn't respond. Instead, he finished his coffee, left payment on the counter, and walked out without another word. By evening, the gang had struck again. This time, it was a small convenience store on the edge of town. Shelves were overturned, the glass door smashed, and the owner, a kind, elderly man, was left trembling as the gang sped off into the night. The attack sent shockwaves through the community, fueling both fear and anger. The next morning, a group of townsfolk gathered outside Joaquin's cabin. Their faces were drawn with worry, their voices overlapping in a chaotic plea for help. "You're the only one who can stop them," one man exclaimed. "They respect strength," a woman added. "And you're strong." Joaquin stood on the porch, his expression impassive as he listened. Finally, he raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "I can't help you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why not?" Maria stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Because you're afraid, or because you don't care?" Joaquin met her gaze, his own steady and unflinching. "Because I've seen what violence does," he said quietly, "and I swore I'd never go back." The crowd murmured in confusion, but Maria pressed on. "So you'd rather let them destroy everything?" Joaquin didn't answer. He turned and walked back into the cabin, shutting the door behind him. As the crowd dispersed, their disappointment palpable, Maria lingered. She glanced at the closed door, her frustration giving way to a flicker of understanding. Inside, Joaquin sat by the window, staring out at the desert. His reflection in the glass was overlaid with memories he couldn't escape. A battlefield, a blood-stained uniform, and faces he would never forget. He clenched his fists, the weight of his promise pressing down on him. For now, the line held. But the storm outside was growing stronger, and Joaquin knew it was only a matter of time before it reached his door again. The atmosphere in the town grew heavier with each passing day. The gang's aggression intensified, their attacks more frequent and vicious. Fear rippled through the streets, its grip tightening on every resident. It was no longer a matter of property being destroyed. Now, lives were at stake. The breaking point came one evening when the gang targeted the small diner at the center of town. They stormed in, overturning tables and smashing windows, their chaos indiscriminate. In the midst of the mayhem, a young boy named Luis, barely 14, tried to intervene, stepping in front of his father to shield him from the blows. A metallic clang rang out as one of the gang members struck Luis with the flat of an iron bar, sending him crumpling to the ground. The gang roared with laughter, their voices echoing through the streets as they left. The boy's father screamed for help, cradling his unconscious son in his arms. Word of the attack spread quickly. By the time Maria arrived at the scene, the diner was in ruins, and the boy had been taken to the clinic. She stood in the wreckage, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and helplessness. Something had to be done. Maria didn't wait for dawn to confront Joaquin. She stormed up to his cabin, her fist pounding on the door. "Open up!" she shouted, her voice breaking the quiet of the night. "You can't ignore this anymore." Joaquin opened the door, his face impassive as he regarded her. She stepped inside uninvited, her anger radiating from every step. "A boy was hurt today," she began, her voice trembling. "He's just a kid, Joaquin, and you're sitting here doing nothing." "I told you," Joaquin said evenly. "Violence isn't the answer." "Don't give me that," Maria snapped. "This isn't about you anymore. These people need someone to protect them. They need you." Joaquin turned away, walking to the small table by the window where a tin cup of coffee sat untouched. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." Maria's voice cracked, her frustration spilling over. "Tell me why you'd rather let people suffer than fight back." Joaquin's shoulders tensed, and for a moment the silence between them was suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I wasn't always like this," he began. "I fought once, for years. I was good at it, too good. And it cost me everything, my family, my soul." Maria softened, her anger giving way to a flicker of empathy. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," she said gently. "But if you think hiding here will erase that pain, you're wrong. You can't change the past, Joaquin, but you can change what's happening now." Her words hung in the air as Joaquin stared out the window. The desert stretched endlessly before him, its vastness a stark reminder of his isolation. Images of the past flickered in his mind, faces lost to violence, promises made in the heat of desperation. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the table as he struggled with the weight of his decision. Then Maria delivered the final blow. "Luis might not survive," she said softly. "If he dies, his blood will be on your hands too." Joaquin's eyes snapped open. He turned to face her, his expression hardening. "No one else will die," he said, his voice resolute. Maria met his gaze, her own steady. "Then you know what you have to do." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Joaquin stepped out onto his porch. He surveyed the desert with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of his promise still heavy but no longer paralyzing. The time for silence had passed. It was time to act. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. Joaquin stood on the porch of his cabin, his expression steeled with determination. The time for peace had ended, and the man he had fought so hard to bury was stirring once more. He began his preparations methodically, moving with the precision of someone who had done this before. Inside his cabin, he opened a small, locked chest hidden beneath the floorboards. The contents were sparse but significant. A compact field map of the area, an old tactical knife, and a leather-bound notebook filled with notes and diagrams. Joaquin's eyes lingered on the items, memories surfacing unbidden. With a deep breath, he closed the chest and set to work. The first step was selecting the battleground. Joaquin spent hours poring over the map, tracing his fingers along the contours of the desert landscape. He settled on the Desfiladero, a narrow canyon on the outskirts of town. Its winding paths and high rocky walls would give him the advantage, allowing him to dictate the terms of the fight. As the sun climbed higher, Joaquin ventured into the desert, carrying a heavy backpack filled with tools and supplies. He moved like a shadow through the terrain, his steps quiet and deliberate. At the Desfiladero, he began setting up a series of traps, concealed snares, tripwires rigged to release rock slides, and carefully placed spikes buried beneath loose sand. Each trap was designed to neutralize without killing, a line Joaquin was determined not to cross. Meanwhile, back in town, Coyote was preparing as well. Word of Joaquin's movements had reached him through his network of informants, and the prospect of a confrontation seemed to delight him. He gathered his gang at their hideout, a ramshackle garage filled with motorcycles and stolen goods. "We've got ourselves a challenge, boys," Coyote said, his grin wide and feral. "El Silencio finally wants to play. Let's make sure it's a game he doesn't survive." The gang cheered, their confidence bolstered by Coyote's bravado. They spent the day arming themselves with chains, bats, and makeshift weapons, their motorcycles roaring as they practiced their formations. Coyote made it clear that this was more than just a fight. It was about dominance, about crushing the quiet man who dared to stand against them. Back at the Desfiladero, Joaquin worked tirelessly, the heat of the afternoon sun beating down on him. By the time the shadows began to lengthen, he had fortified the canyon with an intricate web of defenses. He climbed to a high vantage point and surveyed his work, his sharp eyes scanning for any weaknesses. Satisfied, he descended and began preparing for the next phase. That evening, Maria arrived at Joaquin's cabin. She had heard whispers of his plans and came bearing supplies, medical kits, extra water, and a small revolver. "I thought you might need these," she said, placing the items on the table. Joaquin looked at the revolver but didn't reach for it. "I won't use it," Maria frowned. "You're putting yourself in danger for these people. You deserve to protect yourself." "I'll protect myself," Joaquin said, his tone firm. "But not like that." Maria sighed, frustration mingling with admiration. "You're a stubborn man, Joaquin." He allowed himself a small smile. "I've been called worse." As Maria left, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in shades of deep orange and gold. Joaquin stood outside, watching the stars emerge one by one. He knew the odds were against him, but his resolve was unshakable. This was his fight, his redemption, and he would see it through to the end. The air was still and heavy as dawn broke over the Desfiladero, the rising sun casting long shadows across the jagged walls. Joaquin crouched at his vantage point high above the canyon floor, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. His traps were set, his plan carefully laid. Now all he needed was for the gang to take the bait. It didn't take long. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, reverberating through the canyon like the growl of an approaching storm. Joaquin's grip tightened on the binoculars as he spotted the first motorcycle cresting the ridge. Behind it came the rest, a line of roaring machines, their riders clad in leather and arrogance. At their head was Coyote, his grin visible even from a distance. Joaquin stayed motionless, watching as the gang entered the canyon. They slowed their bikes to navigate the narrow paths, their laughter and jeers bouncing off the canyon walls. Coyote raised a hand, signaling for them to spread out. He was cautious but not cautious enough. The first trap triggered with a sharp snap as a tripwire sent a cascade of rocks tumbling from above. Two bikers were caught in the debris, their bikes skidding and crashing to the ground. Shouts erupted as the gang scrambled to regroup. Joaquin remained hidden, his expression calm as he watched the chaos unfold. The second trap came moments later. A hidden snare tightened around the leg of one of the gang members, yanking him off his bike and leaving him dangling helplessly. Panic began to spread as the gang realized they were being hunted. Coyote barked orders, trying to rally his men, but the canyon's twists and turns made it impossible to maintain formation. Joaquin descended from his perch, moving like a shadow through the terrain. He struck swiftly and silently, using his knowledge of the canyon to outmaneuver the gang. One by one, he disarmed them, striking pressure points with precision to incapacitate without killing. Their weapons clattered to the ground, useless against Joaquin's calculated assault. But the gang was large, and Joaquin was only one man. As the confrontation escalated, he found himself facing Coyote's lieutenants, two burly men armed with chains and knives. They cornered him near a narrow bend in the canyon, their grins savage as they closed in. "Not so silent now, are you?" one of them sneered. Joaquin didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight, his eyes cold and calculating. The fight was brutal and efficient. He dodged the first swing of a chain, using the momentum to disarm his attacker, then drove an elbow into the man's throat. The second came at him with a knife, but Joaquin twisted the blade from his grasp and used it to disable him with a precise strike to the shoulder. Blood trickled from a gash on Joaquin's arm as he stood over the fallen men, his breathing heavy. He didn't linger. The fight wasn't over yet. Above him, Coyote watched the chaos unfold, his grin replaced with a scowl. He revved his motorcycle and roared into the canyon, weaving through the carnage. Joaquin saw him coming and prepared to intercept, but before he could move, a stray bullet grazed his side, sending a searing pain through his torso. He stumbled, clutching his side as Coyote approached, his engine roaring like a beast. Joaquin pushed through the pain, his resolve unbroken. He wasn't finished. Not yet. As the remaining gang members scattered, Joaquin retreated to higher ground, his movements deliberate despite his injury. The traps had worked, the gang was disarmed, but the final confrontation loomed. Coyote was coming, and Joaquin knew the fight ahead would be unlike any other. The canyon fell eerily silent, the echoes of the earlier chaos fading into the vast desert. Joaquin stood at the top of a rocky outcrop, his hand pressed against the wound at his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, but his focus remained sharp. Below him, Coyote dismounted his motorcycle, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Well, El Silencio," Coyote called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've been busy, took out most of my boys. Gotta admit, I'm impressed." Joaquin didn't answer. He watched as Coyote approached, the gang leader's boots kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. The man's grin was gone, replaced by a calculating glare. In his hand, he held a long, rusted chain, its links rattling ominously. "You've got skills, old man," Coyote continued, circling the base of the outcrop. "But this ends here. You think you can take everything from me and just walk away?" Joaquin descended slowly, his steps measured. Pain shot through his side with every movement, but he pushed it aside, his training taking over. As he reached the canyon floor, the two men stood face to face, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, neither moved. The wind howled through the narrow walls, carrying with it the faint scent of blood and dust. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, Coyote lashed out with the chain, the weapon slicing through the air. Joaquin sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid despite his injury. The fight was brutal and relentless. Coyote's strikes were wild but powerful, each swing of the chain forcing Joaquin to stay on the defensive. Joaquin countered with precision, using his surroundings to his advantage. He ducked behind boulders, used the uneven terrain to trip his opponent, and struck with calculated efficiency. But Coyote was relentless. He closed the distance between them, the chain wrapping around Joaquin's arm as the gang leader yanked him forward. The two men grappled, their bodies colliding with bone-crunching force. Joaquin twisted free, delivering a sharp elbow to Coyote's ribs, but the gang leader barely flinched. "You've got fight in you," Coyote growled, his grin returning. "But so do I." The chain snapped out again, catching Joaquin across the shoulder. He stumbled, his vision blurring for a moment. Coyote seized the opportunity, charging forward and tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the air from Joaquin's lungs, but he didn't hesitate. He twisted his body, using Coyote's momentum to roll free. As the fight wore on, the toll on both men became evident. Coyote's strikes grew slower, his breathing labored while Joaquin's movements became more deliberate, each one carefully calculated to conserve energy. Their battle was no longer just physical. It was a clash of wills, a test of who could endure the longest. Coyote lunged again, but this time, Joaquin was ready. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the chain and using it to pull Coyote off balance. The gang leader stumbled, and Joaquin struck, his fist connecting with Coyote's jaw with a sickening crack. Coyote fell to his knees, dazed but not defeated. Joaquin loomed over him, the chain now in his hands. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Memories of his past flooded his mind, faces, battles, choices that had brought him to this moment. The weight of his promise, his vow to never kill again, pressed down on him like a shroud. Coyote looked up at him, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Do it," he spat. "End it." Joaquin's grip on the chain tightened, his knuckles white. But instead of striking, he let the chain fall to the ground. "No," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I won't become like you." He turned and began walking away, leaving Coyote kneeling in the dust. The gang leader let out a furious roar, lunging for him, but Joaquin spun around, his fist connecting with Coyote's temple. The man collapsed, unconscious. As the dust settled, Joaquin stood alone, his chest heaving as he surveyed the wreckage of the fight. The canyon was quiet once more, the gang defeated. He gathered Coyote and the remaining members of the gang, binding them with what was left of the chain, and brought them back to town. By the time Joaquin arrived, the sun was setting, casting the town in a golden glow. The residents emerged from their homes, their eyes wide with shock and relief as Joaquin handed over the gang to the sheriff. Without a word, Joaquin turned and walked away, disappearing into the desert once more. The gang's defeat sent ripples of relief through the town. The captured members, including Coyote, were confined under the watchful eye of the sheriff, their reign of terror finally over. For the first time in years, the townsfolk breathed freely, their fear replaced with cautious hope. Joaquin stayed on the outskirts, avoiding the sudden attention that came with his actions. He returned to his cabin, patching up his wounds with supplies Maria had brought earlier. His hands worked methodically, but his mind was restless. The silence he had once sought felt different now, heavier with the weight of what he had done and what it had cost him. Word spread quickly of Joaquin's actions. By the following morning, a small group of townspeople arrived at his cabin, carrying baskets of food, water, and supplies as tokens of gratitude. Among them was Maria, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You didn't have to do this alone," she said, placing a basket on his porch. Joaquin glanced at her but said nothing. His silence wasn't dismissive, it was thoughtful, introspective. Maria stepped closer, her voice softening. "The people are safe because of you. You gave them a chance to rebuild." Joaquin turned back to his repairs, but Maria didn't leave. "You kept your promise," she continued. "You didn't kill anyone. That matters." He paused, his hands tightening on the wrench he held. "I broke another promise," he murmured. "I swore I'd never go back to that life." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm yet comforting. "You didn't go back," she said. "You used your past to protect the present. That's not the same." The weight of her words hung in the air as Joaquin resumed his work. He didn't reply, but Maria could see the faintest flicker of understanding in his eyes. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. Broken windows were replaced, vandalized walls repainted, and businesses reopened. The townsfolk worked together, their collective effort symbolizing a newfound unity. Joaquin remained on the periphery, quietly assisting where he could. His presence was understated but unmistakable, a reminder of the strength that had saved them. The sheriff, a grizzled man who had long been outmatched by the gang, approached Joaquin one afternoon. "You've done more for this town in a week than I have in years," he admitted, tipping his hat. "If there's anything you need, you just say the word." Joaquin nodded but didn't ask for anything. His actions hadn't been about recognition or reward. They had been about necessity, about doing what was right. Maria, however, wasn't content to let Joaquin retreat entirely. One evening, she invited him to the bar, now bustling with life again. "Come on," she urged. "You've earned this." Reluctantly, Joaquin joined her. The patrons greeted him with cheers and heartfelt thanks, their admiration genuine. Maria poured him a drink, sliding it across the counter with a smile. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her own glass. Joaquin hesitated before lifting his glass in return. The weight of the past still lingered, but in this moment, surrounded by gratitude and warmth, it felt just a little lighter. As the night wore on, Maria leaned against the counter beside him. "You could stay," she said softly. "The people would welcome you." Joaquin's gaze drifted toward the window, where the desert stretched endlessly beyond the glow of the town's lights. "This isn't my place," he replied, his voice low but steady. "Not anymore." Maria didn't press him. She knew Joaquin well enough to understand that his path was one he had to walk alone. But as he left the bar that night, she couldn't help but hope that one day he might find the peace he sought. not in isolation, but among the people whose lives he had changed. As dawn broke over the desert, Joaquin stood outside his cabin, his belongings packed neatly into a small bag. The air was crisp, the horizon bathed in hues of gold and amber. The town was stirring to life behind him, its people beginning another day free from the shadow of fear. Joaquin glanced back once, his eyes lingering on the faint silhouette of the town. He had done what he could for them, but he knew his presence carried risks. Trouble had a way of following men like him, and he refused to let his past endanger these people any further. Before leaving, he placed a note on his cabin door, a simple message written in his steady hand. Protect each other. Strength comes in unity. It was both a farewell and a reminder of what they could achieve together. Joaquin walked toward the horizon, his steps steady and deliberate. The weight of his actions remained with him, but it no longer felt suffocating. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of possibilities. As he crested a hill, he paused. In the distance, a figure stood watching, their silhouette framed by the rising sun. Joaquin's hand instinctively brushed against his side, where his knife rested. But the figure didn't move, and neither did he. The desert wind carried a sense of inevitability, whispering of challenges yet to come. With a final glance back, Joaquin disappeared into the vastness, ready to face whatever awaited him. In the end, Joaquin's story reminds us that sometimes standing up for what's right means facing the very things we fear most about ourselves. His journey shows the power of redemption and the strength it takes to choose a different path, even when violence seems inevitable. But what would you have done in his place? Would you have kept your promise of peace? Or would you have fought back to protect the ones you care about? Click on the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore what it means to truly face your past. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge your perspective and inspire deeper reflection. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next chapter.